On August 9, 1987, beneath the scorching sun over the Gulf of Venezuela, just north of the Venezuela-Colombia border, an action would unleash a crisis that would bring the two nations, considered by some as sisters, and who had experienced few diplomatic upheavals throughout their history, to the brink of war. A warship belonging to the Colombian Navy enters Venezuelan territorial waters, thus igniting the largest international military and diplomatic crisis Venezuela has experienced since the Wars of Independence, after numerous clashes between both nations. Through these waters, the Colombian corvette Armada de la República de Colombia Caldas would trigger all the radars and alarms of the Venezuelan armed forces in what would become days of tension. Diplomatic back and forth and unyielding stances on both sides, which almost led to an armed conflict. Until then, something unprecedented between the nations. Join us as we review what happened each day in August 1987. In an event that, as time has passed, has been forgotten by both Venezuelans and Colombians, and which has become known as the Corvette Crisis. Caldas. My name is Alessandro Polentino, and this is the New Encyclopedia. But before we start with today's story, we want to invite you to support our channel, to subscribe, to leave a like, to leave your comments, we read them all, to share our videos with each of your friends, and to turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Now, without anything else to add, let's begin today's story. The dispute over the sovereignty of the Gulf of Venezuela, called the Gulf of Coquivacoa by Colombians. It dates back to the separation of New Granada and Venezuela in the 19th century. After the dissolution of Gran Colombia in 1830, both countries tried to establish their borders under the principle of uti possidetis juris, a principle of international law that establishes that new states born from processes of independence or decolonization inherit the borders, the administrative borders that their former colonial divisions had. In this case, Venezuela would inherit the borders of the Captaincy General of Venezuela. New Granada, which later became Colombia, would inherit the viceroyalty of New Granada's borders. However, regarding the Gulf, throughout the 19th century, there was never a clear specification about which nation owned this or that part of the Gulf. An important milestone in this dispute occurred in 1941 when the López de Mesa-Gil-Borges Treaty was signed, also known as the 1941 Boundary Treaty, which defined the land border between Colombia and Venezuela. And through this treaty, Venezuela, in a highly controversial political move, ceded about 108,000 square kilometers to Colombia, mainly by giving up almost the entire Guajira Peninsula, which had previously belonged to Venezuela. However, that treaty did not define the maritime boundaries in the Gulf of Venezuela, leaving the issue open for future negotiations. As a result of these events, there was a significant diplomatic and military confrontation in 1952 over the Los Monjes archipelago, further north in the Gulf, and whose sovereignty had been exercised both de jure and de facto by Venezuelans for several years. There, for the first time, Colombian forces attempted to invade and take over these islands. This attempt was immediately repelled, with strong warnings from the government of President Germán Suárez Flamerich, and above all, from his Minister of Defense, Marcos Pérez Jiménez, who would later lead the Venezuelan nation. After the incident, the Colombian government sent a diplomatic note recognizing Venezuelan sovereignty over Los Monjes. Years later, in 1969, the president of Colombia, Carlos Lleras Restrepo, and the Venezuelan president, Rafael Caldera, began talks in the so-called Cochabamba Declaration, although no agreement was reached. Later, in 1975, the Colombian president, Alfonso López Milchensen, proposed the so-called López-Pérez hypothesis to the Venezuelan president, Carlos Andrés Pérez, which combined an intermediate delimitation with joint resource exploitation. But the lack of internal political support in Venezuela prevented this hypothesis from being realized. In 1980, another approach was taken under the governments of Luis Herrera Campins and Julio Cesar Turbay Ayala, with a compromise proposal known as the Carabalita hypothesis, which considered dividing the Gulf equally. However, this initiative faced strong rejection, especially in Venezuela, where military sectors considered it unacceptable to share national sovereignty, and this proposal was ultimately abandoned. By 1987, the delimitation of the Gulf of Venezuela was still unresolved, and both nations maintained irreconcilable positions. Colombia maintained its right as a coastal country to a portion of the Gulf, advocating for drawing an intermediate or equidistant line between the coasts of both countries through the so-called median line thesis. Venezuela, for its part, supported by a large amount of evidence, claimed practically the entire Gulf as waters that have historically belonged to Venezuela, proposing that the maritime border should follow the line extending from the land border at Castillette, the point where the land border between Venezuela and Colombia reaches the Gulf, out to sea. Intermediate formulas had been considered between these extreme positions, but none achieved lasting consensus. So by August 1987, the Gulf of Venezuela remained an area that was not officially delimited and was subject to strong sovereignty claims that would soon lead to an escalation of tensions between Venezuela and Colombia. But let's pause to talk a little about that region, which would be the setting and protagonist of today's video. Geographically, the Gulf of Venezuela is a wide inlet of the Caribbean Sea, located between the Guajira Peninsula to the west, part of which belongs to Colombia and another part to Venezuela. And between the Paraguaná Peninsula to the east of Venezuela, this region has approximately 748 kilometers of coastline, of which 708 kilometers, that is 94.7%, belong to Venezuela, and only 39 to 40 kilometers, that is 5.3%, to Colombia. In fact, the Colombian coast in the Gulf is a narrow strip at the northern tip of La Guajira, between Castilletes and Punta Espada, which has historically been called the Dry Coast. Well, according to the 1930 agreements, Colombia obtained coastline, but without adjacent waters in that area. Venezuela, consequently, has maintained that the constitutional Gulf constitutes, quote, a historical bay under its control. As the only sea outlet from Lake Maracaibo, it is vital for its security and economy. On the Colombian side, as we said, it is argued that despite having a smaller coastline, Colombia is a coastal state of the Gulf. Therefore, it has the right to claim a territorial sea and exclusive economic zone from its coastal segment. Several theses have been put forward by both sides, and both Venezuela and Colombia have proposed radical borderlines, as well as others that seek a viable solution for both countries, although none have been officially accepted to this day. In this way, let's take a quick look at the different hypotheses from both countries. The most radical hypothesis from Venezuela is the Costa Seca, which, as we already mentioned, claims that Colombia only has access to its own coast, between Castilletes and Punta Espada, without any kind of access to the sea or adjacent waters. This gives the entire Gulf to Venezuela and draws a straight line directly from Castilletes to the north, granting Colombia no extension of the Gulf. On the Colombian side, the most radical thesis is that of the territorial sea, which not only establishes an equidistant line between the Colombian coast and the Venezuelan coast of the Paraguaná Peninsula, but also demands that from its small coast, 2 wedges of territorial sea and 2 wedges of exclusive economic zone be projected, creating a sort of triangle toward the south of the Gulf, claiming a large part of the Gulf's waters. On the other hand, the less radical hypotheses, such as the equidistant median line and the Venezuelan thesis of the median line, they were proposed in various conversations, but none was accepted. The disagreement is deep. For Venezuela, the Colombian presence in the Gulf is minimal and does not generate its own waters, whereas for Colombia, denying its maritime projection is equivalent to leaving it practically without shared access to a sea that borders its territory. In practice, Venezuela has historically been the one to exercise sovereignty over the entire Gulf, with both military and administrative presence. However, Colombia, up until the outbreak of the conflict, had only maintained a sporadic presence, causing friction and diplomatic protests from Venezuela, which would soon escalate into a major crisis. In this way, the crisis over the sovereignty of the waters of the Gulf of Venezuela finally broke out on August 9, 1987, when the Colombian war corvette Armada de la República de Colombia, Caldas crosses the imaginary line of the Castillettes parallel to the south, entering the central area of the Gulf of Venezuela. This action would have taken place under orders from the command of the Colombian Navy, previously approved by the Colombian President Virgilio Vázquez, to establish presence and surveillance in that area disputed by both nations. In the early morning of August 9th, Venezuelan radars detected the unauthorized presence of the Colombian ship in waters, whose sovereignty was still in dispute. Venezuela considers any incursion south of the Castilletes parallel to be especially sensitive, an area it declares, quote, off the table for negotiation because it lies off the coast of La Guajira. For this reason, the Venezuelan Navy reacts immediately, sending the missile patrol boat ARB Libertad to intercept the corvette Caldas. When both ships are approximately 2 kilometers apart, a tense radio exchange takes place. Corvette Caldas captain communicating, quote, "You are in the Colombian exclusive economic zone. Please withdraw," end quote, to which the captain of the Venezuelan ship replies, quote, "You are in Venezuelan territorial waters. You must withdraw," end quote. Each commander essentially orders the other to leave the disputed area, reaffirming that this zone belonged to their country, although neither of them can see each other at that moment. During those morning hours, the corvette Caldas maintains an eastward course, that is, heading toward the coast of the state, Falcón, in Venezuela, until, due to Venezuelan insistence, it would have turned west, temporarily remaining in a position just outside the area patrolled by Venezuela. The patrol boat Libertad closely follows the intruding corvette without opening fire, but reporting the situation to its naval command. As August 9 progresses, the corvette Caldas and the patrol boat Libertad continue in a tense status quo. Both countries increase command consultations. The commanders of the ships request instructions from their naval bases, which in turn receive orders from Bogotá and Caracas to hold their positions in the Gulf. Towards the afternoon, the corvette Caldas withdraws slightly to the north of the Gulf, where it meets with the Colombian submarine Armada de la República de Colombia, Tirona, which had been deployed as reinforcement to carry out previously planned resupply and training tasks. Before parting ways, the captains of both countries exchange one last mutual warning over the radio, each reiterating their nation's sovereignty over those waters. Finally, the Venezuelan patrol boat Libertad temporarily withdraws to the southwest, heading toward the Venezuelan archipelago of Los Monjes, awaiting support from other vessels. Meanwhile, the corvette Caldas remains in the disputed area, anchored and under observation. That night, on August 9th, the Venezuelan government, under President Jaime Luchinchi, declared a state of military alert following the incursion at the Miraflores Palace. Luchinchi calls his top cabinet, including ministers, military commanders, and congressional leaders, to assess the seriousness of the situation. It was concluded that the presence of the corvette Caldas, quote, was not a random event, but a premeditated plan by Colombia, end quote, as stated in the resolution. Therefore, Venezuela decides to prepare for, quote, a larger scale action. That same night, the Venezuelan foreign minister, Simón Alberto Consalvi, delivers a strong diplomatic note of protest to the Colombian ambassador in Caracas, Pedro Gómez Borrero. In it, Venezuela reaffirms its sovereignty over the waters occupied by the corvette. Caldas immediately demands the withdrawal of the Colombian ship and warns, I quote, "The Venezuelan government has avoided taking all the measures that the circumstances justify," end quote. This phrase makes it clear that Venezuela was holding back from responding with force. But at the same time, it implied that such a response would be legitimate if the violation of its jurisdiction continued. This was a serious warning, considering that in 1987, the Venezuelan armed forces were among the best in the continent. While Colombia only has 69,000 active soldiers, they are undoubtedly well prepared for armed conflicts or guerrilla warfare in Colombia. Venezuela has about 343,000 active soldiers, cutting-edge military technology, and a large military budget and economic resources available in the event of a possible war. Therefore, at that time, Venezuela was militarily far superior to Colombia, and sooner or later, Venezuela will be forced to demonstrate that military superiority against Colombia. In this sense, given the persistence of the Caldas Corvette in the area, at dawn on August 10, Venezuela sends naval reinforcements to the Gulf area. First to arrive was the missile frigate ARB General Salon, accompanied by the gunboat patrol vessel ARB Independencia. Hours later, the frigate ARB Almirante Brion joined them, whose commander assumed tactical coordination of the operation. With these additional units, the Venezuelan Navy surrounds the Caldas Corvette at a prudent distance, but increases the deterrent pressure. Meanwhile, the patrol vessel Libertad takes advantage of a stopover at the Punto Fijo base to resupply, including loading Automat Mark I anti-ship missiles, which it did not initially carry. After rearming, this patrol vessel sets sail again toward the Los Monjes area, ready for any confrontation in open sea. The Venezuelan ships keep the Colombian corvette surrounded, although for now it remains in international waters adjacent to the disputed area on the mainland. Both governments are holding crisis meetings in Caracas. Concern is growing over the escalation and the high likelihood of an open and declared war. President Lucinchi is consulting with his top military command and several political figures. He even sends his ambassador in Bogotá, Luis Loredo Lacorte, to personally express Venezuela's grave concern to the Colombian president, Virgilio Barco, in Bogotá. That same night, on August 10th, Barco receives Ambassador Lacorte at the Casa de Nariño. According to some sources, the Venezuelan diplomat, in formal and protocol terms, conveys his government's firm stance. Venezuela considers the incursion a deliberate provocation and would not back down from its claim. President Barco maintains a measured tone, and the next day, he would declare to the press that the incident was largely due to the lack of demarcation, and he described the Venezuelan protest note as, open quotes, a bit too harsh. On the night of August 10th to 11th, the situation in the Gulf became more delicate. The Venezuelan frigates continue closely tracking the Caldas Corvette. Reports indicate that the ARB Brion frigate detects the Colombian corvette on its radar, moving without lights near the Guajira Peninsula. Once again, south of the Castellets parallel, that is, within the area that Venezuela considers unquestionably its own. The tension rises when the Venezuelan patrol boat Independencia performs a test cut maneuver in front of the corvette Caldas, dangerously crossing its path. This feint of collision is considered an openly hostile act, as it could have caused a serious naval accident. The corvette Caldas changed course to avoid a collision but remains in the Venezuelan zone. Therefore, at dawn on August 12, Venezuela intensifies its deployment. The Venezuelan High Military Command orders all units on the border with Colombia to be put on alert. In addition, 2 armed F-16 fighter jets take off from El Libertador Air Base with the mission to fly over the corvette, Caldas. Thus, the F-16s perform low-altitude flybys over the Colombian corvette, passing at very low altitude. The Venezuelan pilots report that the guns of the corvette Caldas were neither aimed nor ready to fire, and that the Colombian crew did not appear to be at combat stations. Therefore, after several intimidating passes, the fighters returned to base without any major incident occurring. At the same time, the Venezuelan Navy reaches its highest level of naval mobilization in history up to that point. By this date, it already has 8 warships in the theater of operations. In addition to the Salombrión frigates and the patrol boats, the ARB Mariscal Sucre and ARB General Urdaneta frigates are added, as well as 2 Venezuelan Type 209 submarines, the ARB Sabalo and the ARB Caribe. These last ones are deployed stealthily to monitor the Colombian submarine Armada de la República de Colombia, Tirona, and to cover any potential underwater threats. Venezuela practically militarizes the entire Gulf, preparing for a possible large-scale naval battle. On the Colombian side, far from backing down, the military presence is also being reinforced. The Colombian Navy orders the corvette Armada de la República de Colombia, Antioquia, to resupply in Cartagena and head to the Gulf to relieve the corvette, Caldas. The plan is to indefinitely extend the presence in the area. When a ship ran out of resources, another Colombian ship would arrive to take its place. In this way, the corvette Caldas, after a week out of port, is about to need resupply, so its replacement is planned before it departs, the corvette Caldas. It also reloads its own torpedoes and missiles to be ready in case of combat. This means that both navies, Venezuela's and Colombia's, are actively preparing for a possible confrontation, multiplying men and equipment in the area. This crisis soon begins to worry the international community. The Colombian ambassador to the Organization of American States, Carlos Lemus Simons, files a formal complaint against Venezuela. On August 12th itself, protesting against the overflights of Venezuelan planes and the movement of armored troops toward the border, Venezuela had indeed deployed tank and artillery battalions to the land border as a deterrent against any Colombian action in the north of the state, Zulia. For Colombia, these Venezuelan movements were extremely aggressive, so the diplomatic clash escalated in parallel with the military clash in the Gulf. Returning to the near-military conflict in the afternoon of August 12th, a potentially explosive incident occurred. One of the Venezuelan frigates, the ARB Mariscal Sucre, detected a Colombian military plane approaching the area. Immediately, the Venezuelan commander ordered his crew to take combat positions and set the rules of engagement. If the enemy aircraft crosses into the range of their anti-aircraft missiles, they would shoot it down without further warning. The Colombian plane never gets close enough and withdraws, avoiding a catastrophe. This incident shows how close both sides of the conflict were to confrontation. By this point, instead of easing, things were about to get even more tense. In this sense, in the early morning of August 13, the corvette Caldas temporarily anchored off Castilletes. In the area patrolled by Venezuela, several Venezuelan vessels cautiously surrounded her from a distance. At that time, the Venezuelan patrol boat ARB Patea, which had just arrived, spotted something worrying: the periscope of a submarine surfacing near the Los Monjes archipelago. It is immediately presumed to be the Colombian submarine. Tirona contacts the frigate Sucre, receives orders to search for the intruding submarine with active sonar, and to prepare its torpedoes for a possible submarine attack. For a few minutes, there is a sense of imminent underwater combat. However, before the situation escalated, the Venezuelan Naval Command decided not to attack first and ordered the pursuit of Al Tayrona to cease. As it nears the border with Colombian international waters northeast of the Gulf, the Colombian submarine evades contact. Apparently, its presence was intended to provoke Venezuela into taking any offensive action. That same day, August 13th, there are also some incidents in the air. Venezuelan F-16 patrol planes detect a pair of Colombian Mirage 5 fighter jets flying near the border area. The Venezuelan F-16s take off from El Libertador Air Base, located in the state of Aragua, and detect the delta wings of the Mirages flying by at high speeds. Already inside Venezuelan territory in response, the F-16s chase the Mirages, which quickly returned to Colombian territory. Clearly, the Colombian Air Force was testing the response capability of both the Venezuelan radars and the F-16s of the Venezuelan Air Force. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground grows unsettling. Venezuela had begun to move troops and armored vehicles toward the border with Colombia in Táchira, Apure, and Zulia, fearing that the maritime crisis would escalate into a much broader conflict. Colombia, for its part, also puts its armed forces on alert. In fact, the Colombian General Command reviews several of its war scenarios. Until then, they considered a conflict with Venezuela to be a third priority after their territorial problems with Nicaragua over the San Andres archipelago and the internal conflict with drug trafficking and the guerrilla. But after August 13, they raised the conflict with Venezuela to the most extreme and imminent war scenario. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan president, Jaime Lucinchi, takes a drastic measure in the economic sphere. On the night of August 14th, he orders the complete closure of the land border with Colombia, prohibiting all traffic of goods and people. This decision was made after Venezuelan intelligence detected Colombian soldiers in civilian clothes buying gasoline at gas stations on the Venezuelan side. This was done to supply their military vehicles. Fearing infiltrations or enemy logistical preparations, Venezuela decided to interrupt border trade as additional pressure. The closure affects thousands of civilians on both sides, but it is hailed in Venezuela as a demonstration of national resolve. Returning to the Gulf, despite the solid Venezuelan military response, the Colombian forces do not give up, as the Colombian frigate Independiente soon arrives to relieve the corvette Caldas on August 15. This relief, however, also raises the alarm among the Venezuelan ranks, who saw it as a hardening of the Colombian stance. However, in the early morning of August 16, the point of greatest risk of combat occurs. On the previous night, Venezuelan detectors picked up that the Caldas Corvette, shortly before withdrawing, illuminated the Venezuelan frigate with its fire control radar, Sucre. This lock-on action is militarily interpreted as a prelude to firing at the Sucre frigate. All the sailors jump to get ready for contact and respond with fire. However, from the bridge of the Colombian corvette, they reported that it was a mistake, to which the Sucre frigate issued a warning. He warned that if it happened again, he would fire without a warning. For the Venezuelan forces, it was an alarming sign, as the Colombian forces were going further and further to test the reactions of the Venezuelans. Hours later, the Sucre frigate responded by illuminating the Colombian frigate with its own fire control radar. After so many provocations by the Colombians in the air, on land, and at sea, the Venezuelans prepared to give an ultimatum they had been waiting for, either to end the conflict once and for all or to formally start the war that the Colombians had been seeking for almost 8 days. In this context, August 17, 1987, is the decisive day of the crisis. Early in the morning in Caracas, President Lucinchi holds emergency meetings at Miraflores with former presidents, party leaders, top military commanders, and his foreign minister. The consensus from these meetings is that Colombia was not showing any signs of backing down, so Venezuela had to consider strong actions. However, in Bogotá, President Virgilio Barco faces opposing pressures. On one hand, the Colombian public is just beginning to learn about the real seriousness of the matter, since the government had kept a low profile with information to avoid alarming the population. And on the other hand, the international allies of both nations are urging calm. That August 17th was a holiday in Colombia, and Barco spent the morning meeting with his foreign minister, Julio Londoño, evaluating diplomatic options while receiving messages from abroad. The Secretary General of the Organization of American States, João Banea Suarez, sends official communications to Bogotá and Caracas, calling for restraint and, I quote, measures to ease the situation. Likewise, the president of Argentina, Raúl Alfonsín, a personal friend of both leaders, calls Barco and Lucinchi. He personally offers himself as a mediator and emphasizes the need to avoid an armed conflict in the region. Within diplomatic tradition, he hears these pleas but offers no clear answers. Returning to Venezuela, President Lucinchi, backed by all Venezuelan political forces, including the opposition, decides to demand the withdrawal of the Colombian frigate Independiente, or else he would authorize its sinking. It was later learned that by the afternoon of August 17, Lucinchi had already approved an attack on the Colombian ship. If it remained there? When the ultimatum expired, the orders were communicated to the military commanders in the theater of operations. Venezuela was ready to open fire that very night. In fact, Lucinchi was scheduled to address the nation on a televised broadcast at 9 p.m. to announce and justify the measure. At the same time, that is, on the afternoon of August 17, Barco was informed by his intelligence services of unusual movements. Radio communications between the frigate and Independiente and the Venezuelan ships suddenly ceased after the silence order issued by Venezuela. These events are interpreted as clear signals, even though there was no official verbal or written ultimatum from the Venezuelan government. Cutting communications is often, in the military sphere, a prelude to opening fire in Bogotá. Virgilio Barco faces a critical dilemma: to keep the ship and risk a war by not giving in, or to withdraw the vessel and resolve the crisis diplomatically. Under these circumstances, that night Barco chooses peace. The Colombian government decides to withdraw the Independiente frigate before Venezuela fires the first shot. At 11:45 p.m. at Bogotá time, Virgilio Barco unexpectedly addresses the nation in a message broadcast by Radio Nacional, interrupting the regular programming on both radio and television. In fact, the Godfather movie was being broadcast on television, which was abruptly cut off. In his message to the nation, Barco announces in a brief speech just about a minute long that, I quote, reiterating the rights that Colombia has in the Gulf of Venezuela, and responding to the request for de-escalation from the Secretary General of the Organization of American States and President Alfonsín, the Colombian government has taken the appropriate measures to help normalize the situation that has arisen, end quote. Behind this diplomatic language, as was later clarified, Barco was actually reporting that he was ordering the Colombian ship to withdraw from the disputed area. He also emphasized that he was doing so following, open quote, Colombia's pacifist tradition, end quote, to show that his country prioritized peace with other nations. In other words, Colombia was not giving up its claim over the Gulf, but it was withdrawing the Independiente frigate in order to avoid war. Minutes after Virgilio Barco's address, past midnight and into August 18, the Colombian Navy's chain of command transmitted the order to withdraw. In this sense, the Independiente frigate turned around and moved north of the Gulf, bringing the incursion to an end. In this way, in the early hours of August 18th, 1987, the Caldas Corvette crisis came to an end without a single shot being fired. War between Venezuela and Colombia was just hours or even minutes away, but diplomatic intervention and last-minute prudence prevailed. Although the crisis ended peacefully, each country maintained its principled position regarding the substance of the dispute. Both governments issue official statements justifying their actions and making it clear that they do not relinquish their rights over the Gulf. Venezuela, for its part, claims to have achieved a diplomatic and strategic victory in defense of its sovereignty. The government of Lucinchi maintains that Colombia had violated Venezuelan waters and that its forced withdrawal reaffirmed Venezuelan jurisdiction in the Gulf. In the press release issued on August 9 at the beginning of the conflict, Venezuela had already made its position very clear. Quote, "We reaffirm our sovereignty over the maritime area occupied by the corvette Caldas and demand the immediate departure of the Colombian warship." End quote. Likewise, Venezuela warns that it reserves the right to act, adding that, quote, "The Venezuelan government has avoided taking the measures that the circumstances justify." End quote. And just as it was stated in the same note of protest, this phrase, later quoted by the press, was interpreted as a veiled threat of the use of force. If Colombia never yielded during the crisis, Caracas emphasized before the Organization of American States and other forums that there was no accepted delimitation in the Gulf and that Colombia was provoking a serious incident. Therefore, Venezuela presents the incident as a unilateral Colombian act to force negotiations under pressure, something totally unacceptable to its government. In later speeches, Lucinchi and Foreign Minister Consalvi highlight the national unity achieved in Venezuela. Since all political forces and the people closed ranks in defense of the Gulf, which strengthened their position, Venezuelan media praised the bravery of the Navy for upholding territorial integrity without hesitation. And finally, the official Venezuelan narrative. He emphasized that Venezuela never backed down and that it was Colombia who had to remove its ships from the Gulf. For its part, Colombia defends its actions while emphasizing its commitment to peace. In his August 17 radio message, President Barco reaffirmed Colombia's rights in the Gulf of Venezuela, making clear the country was not abandoning its maritime claim. A few hours earlier, the Colombian government had delivered an official note in response to Venezuela. That is, on the same August 17, in which it rejected the Venezuelan position that the incident occurred in Venezuelan waters. In this sense, it reiterated the traditional Colombian position of the median line and asked, I quote, President Lucinchi to order the withdrawal of his vessels from Colombian territorial waters, end quote. That is, Colombia versus Portugal. He protested, stating that it was Venezuelan ships that were in Colombian waters, according to his argument, and not the other way around. After the Colombian withdrawal, Barco frames his decision as a gesture from Colombia to avoid a war between sister nations, complying with international exhortations. He also emphasizes the supposed pacifist nature of the country, recalling that Colombia has historically sought negotiated solutions. He says he stepped back because Venezuela seemed ready to use force, not because he was giving up Colombia's rights over the Gulf of Venezuela. In fact, days after the crisis, the Colombian government insisted in diplomatic forums that the absence of a border agreement was the cause of the incident. He called for talks to resume, but rejected any impositions. In retrospect, the Caldas Corvette crisis was the moment of greatest military tension between Colombia and Venezuela in the 20th century. Although open conflict was avoided, bilateral relations remained deeply strained for years, and mutual distrust prevailed. For its part, Venezuela reinforced its presence in the Gulf and modernized its weaponry, preparing for any future incident. Colombia, for its part, began to be more cautious in the Gulf, but did not stop its patrols in the disputed area. From a historical perspective, those days in August 1987 consolidated two nationalist narratives in both countries. For Venezuela, the incident was the reaffirmation that the Gulf of Venezuela is an inalienable part of its maritime territory. and that its government's decisive actions boosted national pride. But for Colombia, there was a bittersweet feeling of having avoided war, but having to withdraw. Nevertheless, Bogotá insisted that there was no defeat, since its legal rights remain intact and only the strategy was changed to peaceful means. In any case, the Caldas Corvette crisis became a symbol of dispute. Its incursion and withdrawal marked a turning point in the Colombian-Venezuelan relationship. It sparked a delimitation conflict over the Gulf of Venezuela that has not been resolved to this day. Finally, the crisis served as a wake-up call. And since then, despite political ups and downs, neither country has come so close again to an armed conflict between the two. Dear friends, thank you for watching until the end. We hope you enjoyed it. We remind you that your support is essential for the growth of this great project. That's why we invite you to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share our content with all your friends, and stay tuned for our upcoming releases. See you next time.